Rajeshi Singhal is an economist, journalist, and policy consultant with experience at Economic Times, Mint, and a private sector bank. A former fellow at N.C.E. and the University of Pennsylvania, he has contributed to financial policy reforms in India. He writes regularly for Mint and Money Control on financial services and economic policies. His expertise in banking, policy, and strategy makes him a key voice in India's financial discourse. Sir, we hand over the stage to you.
Welcome to this post-lunch session on the economy. My name is Rajeshi Singhal, and I am delighted to welcome as my co-panelists Anagha Deodhar. She's an economist with ICICI Bank. She has 19 years of rich experience in analyzing the Indian and global economy. Before ICICI Bank, she worked with Credit Suisse, KPMG, and Aditya Birla Group. She has a master's degree in economics from Gokhale Institute of and Public Economy. Please welcome Anagha. Has worked across various capacities and departments in the central bank. He's a core central banker, a quintessential central banker. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Chakraborty to the stage. Hello. Can you hear me at the back? So let me get this show on the road. Very quickly, let me give you a broad outline of the Indian economy as things stand today. It may be a cliche, but it is also a truism that the Indian economy is at a critical juncture today. We're going through a very decisive moment and a time which will determine whether we leapfrog ahead or whether we have to defer our ambitious growth plans. Because the reasons are very simple, and I quickly go through them. One, growth is stagnating. We need to grow by 8, 9, 10% to be anywhere near an advanced economy, but we are caught in the 6.5% growth trap. There is rising unemployment. Manufacturing has shrunk. It has reached 13% of GDP, the lowest in many, many decades. Where whatever little manufacturing is happening, we are seeing stagnant productivity. There is no increase in productivity. Part of our economic growth is predicated on productivity rising. So whether it is productivity of capital or productivity of labor, our productivity has stagnated, in some cases also fallen. Private capex, private sector investment in new plants, machinery, factories has stagnated also, despite low taxes, low interest rates, and government stimulus programs. Household financial savings, one input into investments, household financial savings has been dropping. Our exports, despite all the noise we make, is still less than 2% of world exports. So that is the landscape. And so having provided the ground, let me now quickly go into the questions. So first question to you, Anagha, and this is the one thing that's, occupying everybody's minds. So the government has been investing a lot in capex. There is a report that said over the past 11 years, the government has invested close to 54 lakh crore in capital expenditure. And yet, I mean, theoretically and historically, this kind of investment by the government is supposed to draw in private sector investment, which will then create jobs, incomes, and growth, right? But despite so much investment by the government, we still see no private sector investment. We've been hearing for the past many years that, it'll pick up now, it's almost picking up, but we don't see any pickup. If you see steel consumption data, or you see import data for capital goods, there is no demand for investment. Why do you think there is this gap between government stimulus program and private sector investment?
It's a very relevant question, and it's something we get asked almost in every client meeting that we have. Why is private sector capex not picking up, and where is the gap? So I'll first talk about the background that you gave about government infrastructure investment. You're absolutely right. In the last, let's say, 10 years, 2014-15, and now 2025-26 budget that was recently announced, the central government's capex as a percentage of GDP has more than doubled. So at around a decade ago, you were around 1.7% of GDP, and now you stand somewhere around 3.4% of GDP. And an insane amount of money is being poured into building physical infrastructure. So there are, let's say, this year's capex absolute number is around 11 trillion, slightly over 11 trillion. And most of this money is going into 2 or 3 main sectors. The road sector, national highways, that's somewhere around 2.7 trillion rupees. So that's more than 25% of the total capex expenditure. You have the railway sector, which is getting another 2.5. So these 2 sectors alone are 50% of the capex. And the reason they're building, or they're focusing so heavily on building physical infrastructure is because it ties very well with what they intend to do. And the objective was, India somehow missed the manufacturing bus. We went straight from agriculture to services, and services are doing very well. But for sustained economic growth, you have to have a very strong manufacturing base, which India doesn't have. And that also led to the PLI scheme, the Make in India scheme. So all these schemes were aimed at building a manufacturing base domestically. The problem is, you can't have a world-class manufacturing base in the country if the physical infrastructure is lacking. So you need to be able to move goods around the country, within the country, at a cost-effective rates. You need good electricity coverage for factories to operate, so on and so forth, which India didn't have. And the infra push was aimed at building infra and bringing India's infra on par with global infra, so that when the manufacturing base is being made, it complements the manufacturing. And that was the main objective. And even for PLI, the objective was, we'll give PLI incentives for, let's say, 5 years, another 5 years, possibly another 5 years. In the meantime, you're building infra. And the cost disadvantage that Indian manufacturers face compared to their global peers, that is being met from the PLI incentive. But unfortunately, what is happening globally now is there are very, very big headwinds to global trade. And there is a tariff war, and it looks like it's here to stay for some more time. It's not going away, at least in the short to medium term. And the objective the government had given, that we want to reach a goods exports target of around $1 trillion by 2030. We're currently somewhere around 430. So you're planning to more than double the goods exports target. Similarly, increase the share of manufacturing from, we are currently between 15 to 17, increase it to 25%. So all these objectives now look very difficult to meet because of the trade war. And so this answers the first question, that why is, the second question is, why is it not bringing in private capex? So I think for private capex, the most important thing is the outlook and certainty. So you want surety that these policies will not change abruptly when the government changes. You also want very bright outlook, that if I invest in this particular sector, it will be lucrative for me over a long period of time. So I think what's happening now is because, I mean, there's one tweet comes from the US, in the morning it says something, in the evening it's something else, next day it's something completely different. So you don't know how quickly and how the policies will change. And it's particularly relevant in today's day. And this uncertainty and this ambiguity is what is keeping the private sector away.
So, sorry to interrupt and interject, but my thing is that, private sector has not been investing for the last 11 years.
Yeah.
So, it's not suddenly today.
Yeah.
It's been a malaise that afflicts us over the past decade. Why do you think that is? I mean, many reasons have been given, like, debt overhang, but what do you think is the reason?
Okay. So I'll maybe talk about sector by sector. The first sector you mentioned was the steel sector, and we keep getting these anecdotal information that steel sector, cement sector capacity utilization is now 70%, 75%, 80%. But what's happening is, if the global commodity prices are low, and if Chinese companies are dumping steel into India, and I'm a steel manufacturer, I don't really have an incentive to invest in additional capacity. There is some private capex happening in some pockets where there is PPP, airport sector, for example, the port sector, for example. So you see some PPP happening in select infra sectors. But broad-based, it's not happening, possibly because the outlook is not as bright as the private sector would want it to be.
Okay, hold that thought. So will you hold that thought? Indranil, would you like to add?
Yeah, a little bit. I work with the accounting department of RBI, so these days I actually am a little bothered about accounts. So this budget, government has given a very interesting data. Government has introduced a new table, 4AA. You go to profile of expenditure, 4AA. That table shows that government till 31st December, okay, has roughly sent some 2.5 lakh crore, okay, 11 lakh crores, 2.5 lakh crore, etc. in a scheme called, central sponsored schemes. These are the schemes where government will give 60%, 70% based on whatever, and the balance 30% will come from the states. That will be there. So, government has till 31st December has actually given 2.5 lakh crore. And you guess how much of it has been spent? Out of 2.5 lakh crore, 1,60,000 crores, I have the number, is lying in the bank accounts of those specific nodal agencies. It has not been spent. Okay, so, and the 90,000 that has been spent are the Narega types. That means, these are consumption. And the things that have not been spent on, smart city project. Okay, smart city project possibly has given some 1,800, 2,000, etc. crores in the year. And the balances in the bank accounts are actually in excess of 3,500 crores. That means they are not able to spend this year's allotment. They have not been able to spend last year's allotment also. Okay, similarly, all of us who would agree that, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan was a good thing. But Swachh Bharat Abhiyan urban essentially has the same problem. They are not able to spend. Okay, it might be, look, spending in government is not easy. Okay, government essentially can spend only on a reimbursement basis. Okay, so for that you essentially have to have L1 contractors. People are here from L&T and all that. They would be very well versed. I barely know the process. Okay, but you essentially have to have technical qualification, then L1 and all that. So if I today start planning for a government expenditure, the actual expenditure might actually happen 3 years hence. So the fact is that so there is an inevitable lag in government spending. Okay, and in some cases government is not able to spend. So, Rajdeep, so the point that this year they gave a break in income tax, to me is almost axiomatic. Government felt that I'm not able to spend. Okay, so why don't I give the money? The only thing, and here I actually, I'm only speaking on behalf of myself. I have nothing to do with RBI. I'm just a commoner as I was speaking. So your views are as valid as mine. Okay, is that I think the only quibble I have is that possibly government should have reduced GST rather than direct taxes. Okay, so that is there. But the fact that the money has to be given down to the people for spending rather than keeping it to the government and not being spent is actually becoming very apparent. Okay, that means at a capital expenditure at a level of 3.4% of GDP, as Anaga said, government is not able to spend that level. Government, possibly a more steady state thing will be 1.7, 1.82. So this 3.4 is possibly not a sustainable level of government expenditure. That is my bet.
So, but that still doesn't answer my original question, that over the past 11 years, why is private sector averse to investing? There is one thought, school of thought, which says that there is, and I'm going by RBI data, that capacity utilization in industry has got stuck at 74-75% for the last decade. It's not moving beyond that, and therefore that indicates a lack of demand in the economy. Do you agree with that? And B, what do we do to then move past 75%?
Very good point. And honestly, now there will be some data, it's not there. I don't have a PPT. So let's assume that, this March 25, we will have our nominal GDP at 360 lakh crore.
Yeah.
Give or take a few lakh crore here and there. Okay. Now, say we essentially have the current market capitalization, okay, of listed equities is, again, give or take a few lakh crore here and there is 4.5 lakh, 4 lakh 50,000 crores. Okay, and that has gone up from, say, so it is roughly around 125% of GDP. Okay, it was actually around 90% of GDP, around 7-8, so it has really gone up. Okay, so it is now roughly at 125% of GDP. That is the market cap. So why that is relevant, I will come to it a little later. But the aggregate credit growth to GDP ratio, that has been stuck at 50% of GDP. So this financial year, possibly, Rajdeep, we will end at around, say, 1,90,000 crores of GDP credit growth, etc., etc. So actually, I took the data from 2010 onwards. There was some spike of 52%, 53%, 54%. But again, it comes back to 50. Okay. So the fact is that, the issue is that and why, but the fact is that if globally speaking, 50% of the equity can be pledgeable. So if I essentially have 125% of GDP as my equity value, roughly if I pledge 50% of it, that will be 60% of GDP, right? Okay, so the entire, and my credit to GDP ratio is 50%. So frankly speaking, forget everything, people are actually not even leveraging. So what the corporate sector is doing is that they are making their implicit leverage, that means the book value of debt divided by market value of equity, they have actually reduced. Okay. Now, why exactly that has happened? It's really a puzzle. Okay. And that is a puzzle, and what you say is absolutely correct, because credit to GDP is not improving. That means, the underlying demand for credit, which will drive consumption, is not improving. I actually have a theory that the fact is that, notwithstanding the fact that, RBI is worried about credit quality, this and that. So at 50% of GDP, we are actually reaching some targets. And frankly, so we are receiving those kinds of things. China had a credit to GDP ratio of 194%. And we are reaching these limits at 50%. Okay, so what exactly is happening there? Look, here I don't have data, because I have some data, this thing, but our credit is driven by pockets of states, and they are reaching their limits. Those states, the consumption on those states are actually reaching the prudential limits. But there is a vast hinterland, which is actually not consuming any credit at all. Okay, again, anecdotally, one of those states, not the current governor, some governor some time back, actually visited the chief minister of that state and said that, sir, आपका state में credit deposit ratio बहुत ही घटिया है, 15%, 20% है, आप कुछ कीजिए. Then the chief minister said, साहब, हमारा दोस्त लोग बैंक में जाता है, लेकिन कोई बैंक पैसा ही नहीं देते. So that is exactly the point. So there is a vast hinterland which is not consuming credit at all. And this asymmetric nature of growth is now hitting India's growth limits. It is, according to me, what it is.
So what happens is, we've spoken about there's no demand, and that's what you were referring to, that there's not enough demand, and which again corroborates the earlier point I made, that the outlook is not that bright for the private sector. And I think what's happening is, because in the last 10 years, there was so much focus on building infra, that somehow consumption took a backseat. And the focus on consumption wasn't as much as it should have been, because private consumption particularly is anywhere between 55 to 60% of GDP. That's the main driver of the economy. And if you're not focusing on that, there's only to a certain extent that investment will drive growth. Beyond a point, it cannot drive growth. The sustained growth has to come from consumption pickup. And at a time when you had the households were dealing with, the inflation was very high for a number of years. The households were dealing with very high inflation. Wage growth was quite low, so the incomes were not increasing fast enough, and whatever income increase they were getting, that was getting eaten up by inflation. So that's the reason households are very reluctant to spend. You also see the household assets and liabilities data. You see there is a sharp jump in household liabilities, so households are also borrowing a lot. And that means that a lot of times they're also borrowing for consumption purpose. And that means that if I'm not getting good salary hikes, I don't want to spend, I want to save as much as I can. And that means the consumption wheel in the economy is jammed. And that's the reason your capacity utilization is stuck at 75%, because the incremental demand that a nominal GDP growth rate of 10 to 12% is supposed to generate, it's not generating that. And that's the reason, that was also the backdrop for the income tax cut that we had in the budget, because the government recognizes that investment can only take you so far. You have to boost consumption in whatever way. The earlier budget also they had some income tax cuts, and this budget they had income tax cut. This time was the biggest. And the reason they thought of doing that was, now that I'll give more money to people, more money in the hands of people, they'll start spending more on consumption items, and that will eventually move the needle on capacity utilization. And that will get the private sector interested in spending.
No, I agree, but that's, as Indranil said, that's axiomatic at a level, because you're looking at a very thin slice of the Indian population. By this benefit only applies to a very thin slice of the Indian population. If you were looking at progressive taxation policies, you would have then looked at GST rates. But this will only benefit very few people in that sense. And will it therefore translate into the kind of demand boost that we need for investment to pick up?
So I'll come to the GST point first. And GST, decisions on GST rate are not taken in the budget. There's a GST decisions are not taken in the budget.
I know. That
there is a GST council that meets outside, and decisions on GST rates and what to tax, what not to tax.
The states have to be on board with GST.
State finance ministers are a part of it. And that's the reason it was not done in the budget. It cannot be done in the budget. And we track the GST council meetings regularly. And now there is obviously a thought process that we have to come to maybe 1 or 2 rates. We can't have 4 rates for GST. But there is a lot of resistance from a lot of states. So they don't want the sin tax, the 28% tax to go away. And a lot of people don't want the zero-rated tax to go away. So consolidating from 4 to 2 is becoming very difficult. That is the first thing. And would a GST cut have been better than income tax cut? I doubt, because GST, you look at the items on which GST is charged, it is mostly, so indirect taxes they are more regressive in nature, because irrespective of your income level, you pay the same tax. Income tax cuts are more progressive. And we had seen, I'll just quote some statistics from the finance ministry. Now we have around, out of 1.4 billion, around 8 or 9 million people pay income tax. So that's a very small income tax net. But because they've made compliance easy, the number of income tax filers have started rising very rapidly. And the finance ministry's own estimate is that by 2045, 2047, you'll have around 400 million people filing income tax returns. So that base is increasing very fast. And that's the reason, if you give some incentive to tax filers, that might be more effective than GST cut.
Yeah, I have a basic reservation of, doing 2045, 2047 projections. Because part of this 400 million taxpayers is predicated that they will all be working, earning an income, and therefore filing tax returns. But on the ground, there doesn't seem to be any indicator that shows that we will create so many jobs or employment opportunities. But be that as it may, let me just quickly move on to another question. The other excuse that is often given out for stagnation in private sector investment is that interest rates are very high, okay? And this is typically, private sector. Politicians love to use this because, it takes the blame away from politicians. When when the investment needle doesn't move, it's always easy to blame high interest rates and blame RBI, for instance. How much do you think interest rates play a role in investment decisions? It is important, but is it a life and death issue? Even when interest rates were at historic lows, we didn't see any investment come in. So, do you really think interest rates play that big a role? Or is it something else? Is it low demand? Is it, policy uncertainty?
It's me.
Anybody, both of you can answer. Right?
Now, the point is that, now, the structural market the details are important. Now look, in India, all rates are floating. That means, the fact is that you essentially cut a 25 basis point rate today. What happens is that your market-linked benchmark will get reduced by 25 basis point. That's till the next cut comes. So the fact is that by definition, in a floating rate regime, it is the interest rate path that if I am actually having a project, I will not really bothered about why I'm actually getting a cut of 25 basis point now or 2 months hence or 3 months hence. The fact is that over the life of the project, what is the interest rate path that is likely to presume? So that stability in that path is more important than, in a floating rate regime than actually the absolute quantum of the cut, which is actually not the case in other developed markets. Okay, so the fact is that in US, 30-year mortgages are fixed rate. Okay, so the fact is you essentially cut rates very sharply, refinancing happens and all that. Here actually those kinds of things are not material. Okay, so in such a case, my sense is that the interest rate as an excuse for this thing might be true. We are actually not been able to project a interest rate stability over the 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. No governor has ever done that, simply because we have too many handles to care on. So in such a case, to the extent private investors want certain amount of interest rate stability and we are not in a position to give that, it possibly has hampered interest rates. But frankly speaking, interest rate cost is barely 7% of the project cost. So frankly, with all the caveats I am giving that thing, it is really not a material, it cannot be a very material source for actually my investment decisions. In this particular case, I will actually tell you some again, this is a second-hand anecdotal story. We have these days, in equity markets, we have a lot of corporate houses, actually they call it their own family houses. Okay, so they essentially invest. So they essentially have their own forum, which occasionally meets in Geneva and all that. So there, a friend of mine who used to work with one of these family houses, essentially went, and he essentially gave me a feedback that globally speaking, people, those outside investors say that, they feel that, that vis-a-vis China, Indian promoters are very valuation centric. Okay, the Chinese people are not so valuation centric, they are actually very growth centric. Okay, whereas in India, they say that, with beyond this book value, I will not sell or this or that. Frankly speaking, so they say that, so frankly speaking, those kinds of attitudinal difference about actually capturing whatever surpluses I have also possibly makes a difference in equity penetration. My sense is that. So in some sense, getting the right price in which I will raise equity and essentially the investments is a second consideration, etc., is really there. But honestly speaking, you actually have 180 lakh crore of credit vis-a-vis 450 lakh crore of equity market valuation. So effectively, you have so much buffer to borrow, but you are not borrowing. That cannot be because of interest rate. So clearly, you are deleveraging yourself, practically based on the market equity value. That cannot be an interest rate decision.
Yeah, so I completely agree that interest rates are not the most important determinant when it comes to borrowing decisions. And recently we had one MPC member who highlighted this point and said that you look at the interest costs for MSMEs and medium-scale industries, and the interest rate costs are not compellingly high. So it's not that because RBI is not cutting rates, because there's transmission not happening, that's why the small-scale industries are not borrowing. That's not the case. Outlook is the most important determinant. And what is more important is if the domestic interest rates are too high, and if you're not able to borrow from the banks, large corporates can always borrow from abroad. And you have where interest rates are much lower. So there is at least a 2 to 3 percentage point difference between interest rates in India and abroad. Of course, not everybody has access to it. Only a few large corporates can borrow from there. But I think we also underestimate the role of the new economy is playing, which is the startup space. And there you have PE funding, VC funding. And I was just reading some statistics the other day that startups are somewhere around 4 to 5% of GDP now. They could go up to as high as 10 to 15% of GDP in the next few years. So they are an increasingly larger player in the Indian economy, and they don't depend on bank funding. And so for them, it's really not.
Yeah. No, I agree. Interesting point that Indranil mentioned about family offices. Almost every medium or large business family in India has a family office overseas, either in Singapore or in London or in Geneva or in Dubai. And every business family, almost every business family has one member of the family who's become an NRI to manage the finances overseas. So most Indian business families have moved their surplus overseas and they're investing overseas. They don't want to invest in India. And that is a reality. Why we can debate that, but I think everybody should think about this for a moment.
Okay, but you know, I have one thing. Look at Indian stock market. We are very proud of it, isn't it? But look at the quality of stocks. Where is the new age stock? You know, Indian equity market in terms of quality possibly reflects a very declining economy like UK. Very commodity centric, very service centric, etc. Frankly speaking, there is no new age. So ARM, which was actually a Cambridge University VC's product, got itself listed in US. Okay, so the fact is that again the issue is that, you know, and you go to any CNBC channel, etc. You know, the big people, they talk about, you know what they talk about to essentially say India's prospect. They don't talk about valuation or they don't talk about growth. They simply say that, look, I have so much of untapped potential, so many investors are coming in, so much of cash will come in. So essentially they are actually, but the fact is that those investors have no compulsion to stay invested in India. So that is precisely the point I think we're missing, that we actually don't, we have the Zomatos and the Swiggis, these are the new age, but these are transferred income. They are actually transferring income from the roadside kirana shop to you, to this. So effectively, these are not generating fresh surpluses.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, quickly, we've talked about demand so far, demand for investment from industry side and why that is not happening. But let's look at the supply side. Do we have enough savings in the economy in case tomorrow there is demand for investment? We have seen financial savings in India drop precipitously. Would you like to hazard a guess why that has happened and what can be done to bring it up? I mean, if you look at all the Southeast Asian or China, for instance, they have had huge savings rate, which was able to finance growth and production and manufacturing in the economy. Our savings have dropped. So Anika, would you like to address the issue?
Absolutely, I agree with this point, and every year when we get this household financial savings data, you see that.
Can we have some more volume on this mic, please?
So household financial savings have been declining for a number of years now. And I think the net savings are declining faster because there's an increasing liabilities, because households are also borrowing a lot. There's one thing that's being talked about, even the finance minister spoke about it, and it became quite a big thing, that she said that the young generation doesn't save and they're not used to saving. So to some extent I agree that that is the reason. I mean, you have some cases where there is a startup called Early Salary, where youngsters run out of their salary by 20th or 25th of the month, and the last 5 months they live on borrowed money. So that could be one reason why savings are dropping. I think one more reason is, you are There was a time when the Income Tax Act encouraged savings, and now that has gone away. You have moved to the new income tax regime, and that was happening anyway for a number of years even before this. And now the aim is to move to a completely exemption-less tax regime, both on the direct side and the indirect side. And now some 70% of the income tax filers are in the new tax regime. And the new tax regime says that you don't have to invest in that ATC or whatever it is, and you won't get benefits for it. So if I don't have a tax incentive to buy a house, if I don't have a tax incentive to save in financial products, why would I? So that could be another reason why the household financial savings are dropping. And I think the third reason I can think of is now you're getting better safety nets. There was earlier, maybe my parents' generation or even slightly after that, if you have one medical emergency in the family, all your savings are wiped out because you have to completely pay for it from your own pocket. And now you have insurance penetration is increasing, so that is partly takes care of all these emergencies. You have more transfers happening from the centers, so the Ayushman Bharat and the senior citizen insurance schemes, so on and so forth. It's still nowhere close to where it should be or where developed countries are, but the coverage is definitely increasing. And that means that the compulsion to save is not as biting as it was maybe a few decades ago.
Actually, I'm really puzzled by the financial savings rate at Swadeshi. I think it's really very important that to highlight that financial savings are precipitously low. But having said that, I accept that it's low. But look at last couple of years, look at private sector capital formation. I don't think we should pay much attention to that gross fixed capital formation, etc. But nevertheless, for whatever extent it is relevant, it has not stopped GFCF. GFCF went out all the way to 38% of GDP. It has now possibly on 33, 34, or something like that. So it's above 30. I think just I MOSPI data I think checked. It's around 33 now. Okay, so it has come down, but it's 33. So it's not a particularly bad. Historically speaking, we were above 30 more or less. So it is there. So frankly speaking, if you really look at corporate investments through GFCF, it is not really that bad.
33% is mostly government actually.
No, there's no private sector capital formation. But what is actually GFCF misses out is that, and that is where I think that is, Rajneesh's a very important point is that, it actually misses out, these are essentially buildings and fixed capital. But when in economy driven by services also depends a lot on intangible capitals.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and it is completely missing from the data set. In fact, India's data set doesn't capture the drivers. It feels it should drive it in the next generation.
Yeah. So social capital.
Yes, and most important, for that, I looked at World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. Okay, there, all of you can go there, top 20 things, So India's, obviously, intellectual property filing has gone up. It was 60,000, something like that. It is 98,000. I'm not comparing China. Forget it. You will get sad on hearing China. But even Korea does 4 times that. South Korea. So we are not generating enough intellectual capital. And that, I think, savings is a concern. But I think that is a bigger concern to me.
Yeah. So, we spoke about lack of demand in the economy, lack of demand for consumption, lack of demand for investment by private corporates. On the supply side, there is a fall in private savings available for people to invest. Now, if you look at all of this, the economist Milton Friedman had a popular phrase. He called something, he said, if you have helicopter money, which is basically if you shower money from the helicopter and let it fall wherever it is and let people use that money to spend and consume, and you can stimulate the economy, but it has its problems, right? But using that analogy, we have seen over the past few years, both the center and the state press the accelerator on welfare benefit transfers. A lot of cash transfers are happening by both the center and the state. Politically, one may say that guy is, spending so much, but they're all spending without reservation, without exception. Whether it is the center or whether it is the state, any political party, they all are pushing out a lot of cash because they know it makes sense politically. Because people have no income to spend on, household goods, on daily consumption items, or on health. Now, my question is, how sustainable is this? Where do we stop? When do we stop?
It's a race to the bottom, right? And to give one example of free unconditional cash transfers, last 2-3 years we've had Ladli Behna scheme that every state has introduced, and pretty much, many major states have introduced. And speaking about Maharashtra, which is probably the best managed fiscally, they started with 1,500 per person per month, and they said we'll take it up to 2,100. And in this budget, they just kept quiet about it. So 36,000 was the allocation, assuming 1,500. And if it goes up to 2,100, the allocation is higher. But it's a big bang announcement to say that we'll give free money, unconditional transfers. But you don't follow through on that because you know that it's very expensive. And my problem with these freebies is, like you rightly said, you can give these freebies, but who will roll them back? Nobody will roll them back. So once you launch these freebies, they are a permanent feature of the budget, because whoever rolls it back will lose elections. So it's like who will bell the cat? And it started at the center with the PM Kisan, which is 6,000, 8,000 rupees per person per year. And some states said, okay, center is giving you 6,000, we'll give additional 6,000, which was again an unconditional transfer. But in the farm sector, you could at least see some stress. There were farmers committing suicide. So you were supporting their livelihoods. But free Ladli Behna scheme for women, what is that? Maybe that improves consumption to some extent. But it's a very bad norm to set. It's a very bad thing to start, which you will not be able to roll back. And that means a lot of states their fiscal deficit is anyway above 3.5% this year. And you're supposed to be below 3%. So you do this, and where does it stop? You have states like Punjab and Kerala, which have very high debt to GDP ratio. So it's a race to the bottom, clearly.
Okay, all of us are old actually. So if you have grown in the 80s, okay, there used to be a professor called Abhijit Sen. I think he is the son of Samar Sen. He's a very committed communist, incidentally. Okay, so he and in the pages of EPW, he and World Bank economist, again, both of them are passed, Martin Ravalian. Okay, so they would have a running debate. Okay, now where Mr. Sen would actually talk about direct benefit transfers, and he would quote the Rajiv Gandhi period of 1984 to 1988, telling the fastest poverty reduction happened because of direct benefit transfers, which happened then. And Ravalian would say that is not sustainable, etc., etc. Okay, so they would argue that. But even Abhijit Sen would actually say that you actually do direct benefit transfer, but you actually keep them at a rate, okay, which is lower than the minimum wage rate, so that they become the last option, not the first option. Okay, so they had that amount of grounded, even the communists of 80s have some amount of grounded sensitivity to the fact of labor movement. Okay, but this sense is completely gone. Actually, there was a certain person in the Rajya Sabha who has argued for that minimum wage to be, that in Narega, this thing should be made 450. And the biggest tax, Rajrishi, that is this impinges are essentially it increases the cost of labor for the unorganized sector. And it is catastrophic because of that. But again, the market works. Ultimately, human tendency is not to look at the absolute level, but the growth. So long as the growth becomes unsustainable, you cannot really, 1,500 cannot become 3,000 in the near future, at least not in my lifetime. Okay, so long as that doesn't grow, people will not see electoral returns on this. So possibly over a period of time that will. That's my hope, because people see growth, and growth is not coming, so it will stop reaping electoral dividends, and that, and I think, will actually bring certain amount of sense. But I completely think that the issue of this is that it essentially is one of the reasons MSMEs is in dire straits is simply because of the fact that the cost of labor has become unsustainable. That's it.
No, that's an interesting point, Indranil, about, cost of, what it does to cost of labor in the informal as well as the MSME sector.
Yes.
Because that is the pool from which they hire mostly. I agree with that. It's also because, in some senses it is electoral funding through the back door, right? I mean, the Ladli Bahna scheme was electoral funding through the back door, basically. Because once they won the election, they said, oh, it was not means tested.
Yes, it was not.
Right? I mean, all benefit transfers should be mean tested.
The Supreme Court commented on it, right? And the Supreme Court said that it's not illegal, so we can't stop you from giving freebies, but you have to think about what you're doing. You're collecting money from taxpayers and distributing it to people. So it's a bad habit. We can't stop you because it's not illegal, but you think about what you're doing.
And I can understand the politicians' compulsions also, because if I wear his hat, he's in some senses helpless because he sees the economy is not growing, demand is not growing. His constituency doesn't have access to, income. Real wages have actually shrunk. So instead of pushing policy, this becomes a better idea for the person. But I'm looking at a much larger picture also. What it does is it leaves less money available to the states and to the centers to pursue capital expenditure. In a state, 1 rupee of capital expenditure yields 3 times the multiplier effect than the center. So, that could be, I don't know, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, but it takes time. So capital expenditure, you spend 1 rupee now, it will get you 3.5, 4 rupees, but 2-3 years down the line, not right now. So this free transfer is like a quick fix. That I'm doing it right now, you can see it, money getting transferred.
It pays dividends immediately.
Yeah. And people obviously want current consumption, they prefer current consumption over what you'll get maybe 2-3 years down the line.
So, we are very fortunate today to have Indranil amongst us as a central banker. And I'm going to ask him a few questions on RBI because, so when I did a fellowship at London School of Economics, I had the good fortune of attending classes by this professor called Charles Goodhart. Charles Goodhart is the father of central banking. He's the dada in central banking. And the more I attended his lectures, the more I realized that central banking is an enigma. The deeper you go, the deeper puzzle you get. So, since we have Indranil here, let's ask him, where do you think central banking, regulatory philosophy in India is headed? We have some legacy regulatory frameworks, but then we are, also trying out new things like regulatory sandboxes, SROs, self-regulatory organizations, as a means of addressing the capacity deficit within RBI. So if you can just explain to the audience here, what the sandboxes do, SROs do, and the ability of RBI to balance between the legacy regulatory framework and these new initiatives.
Okay. Thank you, Rajrishi. But incidentally, Charles Goodhart is the first economist recruited by Bank of England in 1962. Prior to that, Bank of England would have generalists like you and me. In 1962, Goodhart was
from Cambridge.
He was recruited by Bank of England as a part of some special drive. Okay, so that's there. So he is really, as you said, there's something called a Goodhart's law. Someday we will discuss. Okay, so now the point is that frankly, regulatory capacity building is actually an issue. Actually, state capacity building. Okay, for example, we actually had this thing on power sector in the previous thing. The one thing that was actually really apparent from the discussions is that, they're talking about regulatory gaps and so many other things, is the fact that, the fact is that regulatory is not able to decide. But it is not a delegated system where the market decides either. Okay, and that actually is imposing a cost. It is actually affecting capital allocation in the economy. So that is, so, but frankly speaking, regulators don't have an incentive to change. Because you go into a place where you don't know anything. So frankly speaking, regulatory change doesn't really happen very often. Okay, and regulatory capacity building also is essentially a kind of a personal exercise. It happens only when there is a certain amount of political push. Okay, and some of this capacity building exercise, for example, why are we doing, say, regulatory sandbox? I don't know how many of you know. What happens in 2019-20, RBI felt that, as I said, that, financial inclusion is not really going anywhere because of the existing technology, etc. So whether there can be new initiatives, technology driven, which actually can generate a certain amount of, give some amount of insights. So actually we had this regulatory sandbox. What does a sandbox mean is that, suppose a bank, suppose ICICI Bank comes, okay, saying that, look, I actually have a model of an algorithmic credit allocation, but I don't know whether this model will work or not. But I want to try it out. But suppose something happens because of this, I will cap my exposure in this model at a certain level. I would give me certain amount of leeway in asset classification norms so that I can actually test out the model. Okay, and frankly, so these are the kind of sandbox. So these are essentially micro bank specific initiatives. Okay, but those are important. Okay, so we have regulatory sandboxes in KYC, AML, bank frauds. I think HDFC has actually this thing on offline fund transfer through a Swedish company called Crunchbase. They're there. But so these are essentially, largely speaking, enabling financial institutions to try out new things. Okay, and not get hamstrung by RBI's regulation. So that is one thing. So it's working, but frankly speaking, the effect will actually take a certain amount of time. As regards SRO, the problem is it is dicier. Actually, RBI Act or BR Act doesn't allow RBI to delegate regulatory functions. So there's no delegation allowed. Okay, so in such a case, SROs can only be a kind of an informal arrangement. Look, these SROs won't have any regulatory power. If somebody essentially says that I belong to, suppose I'm a microfinance company A, I belong to an SRO, and SRO says that, your algorithms on this requires tweaking because etc., etc. I have no regulatory obligation to actually follow. There's no legal obligation to follow, which is actually not the case with, say, US or UK for that matter, where regulatory SROs are actually thing. So clearly, SRO model has its limits, and also SRO is having a conflict of, in the fact that it's conflicted. Industry people are not really going to look at very, very, very material changes. Those will be incremental. Having said that, SRO gives us a base to certain number. It gives us time. It gives us time to understand certain sectors till we capture. Till we catch up. And to that extent, it has started, and we have given 2 or 3 SROs in fintech. So let's see how it works out. Both the regulation part of it, the initiatives and SRO part of it, and compliance to it.
So let me now pivot to some of the questions that we've received. One question, one kind of common question that seems to arise from all these chits is a question that I also have. And so let me just, frame the question for you. So if you look at the Indian landscape, you have India 1, in which you have about 130, 150 million people, which is about roughly 40 million households, with a per capita income of $14,000, like Indonesia, let's say, right? India 2 is about 400, 500 million people, with, the Swiggy rider all the way to the peon in the North Block and the, clerk in RBI and everybody included, some agricultural landholders also, where the per capita income is about $1,000. And then you have India 3, the rest, which is, subsistence level completely.
Sub-Sahara, that is a Sub-Sahara.
Sub-Sahara, complete Sub-Sahara, yeah. Now, a lot of the growth in 2004 onwards was, or 92 onwards, came from mobility from India 2 to India 1. We now see that mobility completely stop. Okay, I mean, one proxy indicator is two-wheeler sales have dropped, right? People are not graduating from two-wheelers to cars. So the guy in the, most car buying is happening in that 140, 150 million India 1 actually. Now, if you have to keep moving, because that, I think growth will depend on how many people move up from India 2 to India 1. Through income generation, through growth. What if, imagine for a moment, Anagha Chindronil, you are Prime Minister for 1 year, and your one single task is to move people from India 2 to India 1. In that 1 year, what will you do?
Okay, no, frankly, I have no idea, but let me actually try. Look, very recently, I also had a chance that, thanks to RBI, 16th Finance Commission wanted certain about municipal finances. Okay, so they actually wanted us to do some accounting issues on municipal finances. So I actually chaired that internal group. I happened to visit this. So the fact that became very apparent from this is that while we actually have such a deficit in urban provisions, we are only talking about municipal corporations. We are not talking about municipalities. We have such a deficit in urban provisions. But what a rich pool of cash these municipalities are sitting on. So the fact is that, the issue is, I think the next growth is actually going to come from, if I were the Prime Minister, from the provision of services to the citizens from this. I think Prime Minister tried that. But this actually has to be done at a municipality by municipality level. And for that, finance is least of the concern. The concern is governance. I know one municipality who told that because there is so much of pilferage of money, that he would not pass one single bill without that project being checked, and that makes that project, the vendors actually without money for 6 months, so vendors don't actually bid for that, the projects for that municipality. So these are the kind of governance issues that is actually keeping our urban provisions back. I feel very strongly, I'm very optimistic that, there is such a deficit in services that can be a very big growth multiplier. But I'm also simultaneously feel that unless certain amount of governance issues are taken care of at those levels, okay, we will continue to struggle, we'll continue to muddle through, because, we will not do too badly, because something or the other consumption will grow, something like that. But, look, we were at 7.5, now we are at 6.5, we'll become 5.5, 4.5, like that. We'll go, over a period of time, we will actually decline. And that decline, can be occasionally very rapid. China was growing at 7.5, 8 till 2015. Now, if they get a 5% rate, they think they are good. Okay, but even China has kind of intellectual property they are exploiting. We are nowhere near that. So the point is that this 6.5 can go to 4.5 within us, because precisely the productive consumption without the hinterland supporting is not going to drive. And the hinterland can only support if we essentially have those kinds of, some grassroots governance, provisions. You essentially need a certain amount of provisioning of services and a demanding populace for that. Okay, so that's my view.
Your chance to become PM, Anagha.
I mean, if there was a magic wand where you could just, in 1 year, you could wipe out poverty, I'm sure a lot of PMs are very smart people, they would have done it. But unfortunately, there is no magic wand where you can just overnight change things. I think there is some data that comes to my mind when you speak about income inequality. And this data is often quoted. And in 2005, around 2/3 of the country's population was in the poor category. And you had a negligible number which was above $40,000. Even the middle class was tilted in favor of lower middle class. And now you've had solid growth for out of the 20 years, maybe for around 10 to 12 years, if you've grown at 7% real GDP. And now the income distribution has changed so much that you only have 15% of the people which are below the poverty line now. Of course, there's a lot of argument about how to measure poverty, but if you go by the,
Poverty has come down, surely.
yeah. So like millions of people have been lifted out of poverty over a period of 20 years. And now there's an emergence of a middle class which is tilted in favor of upper middle class. And you also have 5 to 7% of the country's population, and their lifestyles are equivalent to those who live in the EU. Maybe, people like us who live in urban cities and in the service sector, employed in the service sector. So the income distribution has definitely changed a lot in favor of the population getting richer. And to make sure that that happens, I think there are two to three things that come to my mind. The first thing is you have to support two sectors which employs most of the poor people. Firstly, it's agriculture and construction. So still you have around, there was a time when 55% of the country's population was in agriculture. It's come down to 42%. But still they're so heavily dependent on monsoon, on rainfall happening. If one year the rainfall is poor, a lot of people die, a lot of people commit suicide. And you have to invest in agriculture R&D, you have to invest in irrigation facilities, better crops, so that weather resistant crops, so that no matter what happens on the monsoon front, on the weather front, your production is ensured, and at least the basics are taken care of. And that supports 42% of the country's workforce. So that's one thing. The second thing is, when I said this migration happened from agriculture to construction, you had around 10 percentage points moving from, so 55 became 42, and out of that almost entirely they moved to the construction sector. And construction in India is so disorganized. It is still, there are no proper laws, and we had RERA come in, but still it's a very haphazardly done activity. So you have to bring in proper laws so that people who work in the construction sector, the manual laborers, their incomes are supported.
Where do you see the role of skilling and the role of social security in all of this?
Okay, look, just by sheer chance, I read an article in Mint, just a couple of days back. There, they were talking about Mr. Patnaik's Biju Janata Dal's one initiative. Like they say that, they will make trained in Odisha a brand. Okay, so effectively they say that, what is the, so, and Subrata Bagchi, I think, was Mindtree founder. He essentially was heading that skilling. They're not talking about skilling the college educated. They're talking about skilling the people who are going to ITI. Okay, and that actually had such a visible impact, people, and the particular article was actually talking about that there is a Odisha premium in that labor space. And occasionally the job that they have to do has got nothing to do with the particular this thing. For example, as a part of the skilling, they were told to climb trees, because some of the transmission wires actually you have to essentially gets clogged in. So clearly speaking, Rajarishi, those are the kind of, and that's where, the skill, and skill at all levels. I think that's what is actually has to be our destiny.
Anagha, quickly on social security. What kind of social security can we have? Can we afford social security as an economy?
So a few years ago, there was a lot of talk on the UBI, the Universal Basic Income, and every Indian citizen should get a certain amount. And the economic advisor, the CEA at that time, argued that now the time has come for us to launch UBI. But in my opinion, no, it's still way too early. And that's because, see, there are a lot of piecemeal things you can do that can improve the social security. For example, the subsidies that we give, food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, petroleum subsidy, they're over 2% of GDP. And if you just target those subsidies better, make sure there is no leakage happening, even in Manrega, make sure there's no leakage happening, there are no duplicate beneficiaries, fake beneficiaries. You target these subsidies better, and the money that you can save from targeting these subsidies can be utilized somewhere else. So that is the first thing. And UBI, if I give UBI, let's say 3,000 rupees per person, a lot of people may not have an incentive to work. And I'm just getting money from the government, I'll just sit at home and have fun. So you cannot fall to a level where you're removing incentives from working.
Well, social security schemes in many countries are contingent or time bound. And for you to get reskilled so that you get another job. So once 6 months are over, you stop getting social security payments.
I think you're talking about unemployment benefits and something like unemployment benefits.
Yeah.
If you're unemployed, you get.
So, the point that you will enjoy UBI for the rest of your life without working doesn't take into account two things. One is rising inflation, and B is, at some point, you will need more money, right?
Yes, fiscal cost.
Yeah. I think when schemes like these are launched, they're normally inflation indexed.
And the other question is, how do you finance social security?
You can't. I mean, that's true. I think one way, I read a very interesting statistic that now you have the DBT, the direct benefit transfer. And when COVID started, within the first couple of months, they'd given the benefits to 80% of the beneficiaries because they were able to do it using DBT. Otherwise, it would have been impossible.
Anyway, I've got to bring this to a hard stop. I'm getting constant notes saying, giving me time. So, thank you very much for hearing us out patiently. And please join me in thanking both Indranil and Anagha for providing such interesting insights. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, panelists, for a wonderful session.